There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between radio and bar talk, between commentary and recaps, and it lies between the pit of man's Netflix subscriptions and the summit of his binge-watching ability. This is the dimension of podcasting and the Twilight Zone. These are the Zone-i-Sodes. And now your hosts, Brandon Davis and Scott McFarland.
Hello, everyone out there in podcast land. Welcome to the Front Row Movie Reviews, the podcast for people who actually like movies and TV. And welcome to episode 18 of Zone-i-Sodes, our Twilight Zone podcast. Before we get going, I want to remind everybody that we are in two different feeds right now. You can find us still at the Front Row Movie Reviews feed, but we have moved over to our own feed. So if you search for Twilight Zone podcast or Zone-i-Sodes on your podcasting app of choice, you will find us there, and you're going to want to subscribe to us there because sooner rather than later we will be spinning off, and you will no longer be able to find this show on the Front Row feed. So please make sure you subscribe to our new feed. We're doing this because, well, to be honest, it's hard to find a Twilight Zone podcast when you're searching through movie review feeds. So we want to give ourselves the ability to get out to a wider audience. And to do that, we're going to have to spin off. So be sure to do that. So that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and talk about episode 18, which is The Last Flight. With me today, as always, is
Brandon Davis, your classics guy.
And because I can't remember how I said it, I am Scott, the flashbacks guy. Yep. So, Brandon, before we get into talking about The Last Flight, I'm going to go ahead and give us a little synopsis, and then you can tell us what Rod had to say. So,
sure.
I'm going to say this the British way. Flight Lieutenant Decker is a World War I fighter pilot that ducks into a cloud cover while his squadron fights a German group. He lands in an American air base in France, which immediately tips him off because there's not many in France in World War I, and quickly learns that it is 1959. Decker is told that the Air Vice Marshal Mackay will be visiting the base later that day. But Decker swears that can't be possible because Mackay was one of his squad mates, and there was no way he could survive. Decker also tells his captor, Major Wilson, that he is a coward. He ducked into the clouds to save his own life. After Wilson suggests that someone helped Mackay survive the day, Decker realizes he has been given a second chance. He escapes, with a little bit of help from Wilson, and returns to the cloud he came from. Mackay arrives at the base soon after and tells Wilson that Decker had saved him before Decker was killed. Wilson shows Mackay Decker's personal effects that Mackay believed were lost to the Germans. And Wilson begins to tell Mackay what really happened to Lieutenant Decker.
And here's what Rod had to say at the beginning of the episode. Witness Flight Lieutenant William Terence Decker, Royal Flying Corps, returning from a patrol somewhere over France. The year is 1917. The problem is that the lieutenant is hopelessly lost. Lieutenant Decker will soon discover that a man can be lost not only in terms of maps and miles, but also in time. And time in this case can be measured in eternities.
So, Brandon, what are your first impressions on The Last Flight?
This was an episode that kind of sneaked up on me. I didn't really know what to think of it at the beginning, but the more and more I got into it, the more and more I really liked it. And then I went back and actually watched it again, knowing what was going to happen. And I really, really liked this episode. I think, this is a very talky episode with a lot of monologues in it, but they're really well-written monologues. And the characterizations in this, we talked about in the last episode how characterizations were kind of nil, but in this one there's really great character development, and you really, as you start to peel away all the layers of the backstories of Decker, it really starts to become more and more of a fascinating episode, and also really helps that they shot on location at a real base. And leads to the authenticity of the episode too. So a really, really effective mid-first season episode.
Agreed. This one is in kind of standard rotation, so I've seen it several times. So I knew the twists and how it was going to end, but it still holds up really well. We're gonna, we talk about themes with Twilight Zone quite a bit. Not only we're going to run into this theme again, we're going to run into this story a couple times, because there is a couple times episodes in the run where you have somebody through flying of some sort winds up traveling either forward or backwards in time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this is the first time it's happened. Also, this is interesting because this is not a Rod Serling script or a Rod Serling story. This is written by Richard Matheson, based on a short story. So we talk about Rod so much, and I'm sure Rod had quite a bit to do with this episode too, but we also have a different writer coming into this as well. But I like this episode for a couple different reasons, one of which is just the idea that even in the craziest way possible, you always have a second chance. You always have the ability to make a right a wrong. It's very quantum leapy. You have a chance to go back and make what's once wrong. Well, my God, I can't talk today. Go back and make right what once went wrong. There we go. And by the way, somebody really needs to bring back Quantum Leap. Just saying. One of my favorite shows. So.
I think they're trying to with Timeless, but it's
I watched one episode of Timeless, and it's no longer on my schedule anymore to watch. Oh, it was bad.
Which is funny because it was canceled, but then fans demanded it be brought back, and they are.
Sometimes fans don't have taste. Once Upon a Time is still on the air, and that thing. Okay, so. Yeah. ABC again. Am I seeing a pattern here? I did. This is completely a tirade, but I was listening to the Nerdist, which is a podcast that gets a lot more listens than we ever will. But they were doing a Q&A with Nathan Fillion, and they joked that Nathan Fillion could play Sam Beckett, and I was like, yes, please.
He could.
Please, yes.
Yeah.
And he's at the moment he's unemployed, so give it to him, please. Come on, Netflix, help me out.
That's true.
Okay.
That'd be really good.
Brandon, what did you like about this episode?
The performance of Kenneth, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, Kenneth High, who plays Decker. Not really an actor I knew, but kind of came out of nowhere, but really plays this guy really, really well. You like him from the beginning. I mean, you don't know what his secret is at the beginning, but he's very knowledgeable. He's very good with words. He comes off very charming at some points, but you really feel for him, and there's a real empathy that you have for him. But like I said, just the way this episode is constructed, you have him sort of flying out of the clouds, and you have him landing on the base. You have this mystery of what happens. He's in this, World War I plane, and then little by little, as things unravel, and you learn, that he did this, according to him, cowardly act of deserting Mackay. You really feel for him, and you feel like he's been dealing with these demons for what seems like an eternity. But and then toward the end, once you know that he's able to sort of right these wrongs again, you're really kind of rooting for him. But I think all the actors in this episode are really well cast, because they all kind of have this empathy for him, although they don't know exactly, why he's there, who he is. They just know that, this sort of weird situation's been thrust upon him. But yeah, it's just it's an episode that was even better the second time I watched it, knowing what was going to happen. Just because it really plays out like a really great sort of little one-act play, which, even though, Rod didn't write this, he was really good at structuring these little one-act plays with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, I agree. And, and it's that camaraderie that even though this guy is displaced by over 40 years, he's still in the military. He's still a pilot like these other guys. So they do have an empathy for him, and especially after he comes out and says that he ran. At that point, these guys understand that he does have something he has to go do and to fix, even if he may be crazy and even if it doesn't make any sense. You give this guy the opportunity, which is why I really like when Wilson literally has a gun to Decker's head and basically says, "Okay, you can go ahead and try," which I think is good acting on both their parts, and it's a good story too. I also go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that whole the chase when he escapes and he's getting to his plane and everything. They really the suspense of that is really, really well done, and I think it helps that it was done on location and not in a studio. But the whole thing where he finally gets into the plane and then all of a sudden you see the gun pop out on the screen and you see Wilson's got it and everything. That whole escape for him is really well built as well.
Yeah, and yes. I also like that they don't, and for one, they probably didn't have the budget to give us air combat, but I like that we don't have to go back in time and see what Decker did. I like that we continue on the 1959 timeline, and we just continue with the day. And McKay shows up and is had to be told the same story, because in his recollection, it is what Decker wanted, that he was able to go back and save some of his squad mates and took out 3 Germans before they took him out. So, and I didn't mention the synopsis, but it also, I like the stories about time travel where there's for lack of a better term, a butterfly effect, to where one person's actions can make an amazing difference, because that's really how history works. So we know, based on what was said, that not only did Decker save McKay, he saved everyone that McKay would go on to save in World War II. Yeah, so I mean, it's that ripple effect, that a choice that you make that may even be the last choice that you are able to make in your lifetime can ripple down the ages and continue to affect people's lives, for better or for worse. I like that.
Yeah, and I also think really good job by the actor who plays Mackay, Robert Warwick. This is a character who you've talked about the whole episode and is sort of built up, and a lesser show could have brought in just an actor, just to say these lines at the end, but he comes in and you can feel the history that he has with these characters, with Decker especially, and just the way that he's recalling Decker and everything, and really the way that last scene is played out. It could have been played, I think, really, really sappy, maybe, or really really corny, the way that the fate of everybody was revealed. But they play it very, very smartly, and the actors all do a really, really great job. And like you said, I love time travel stuff too. I wasn't able to be on the Back to the Future podcast with you all, but that's one of my favorite movies as well, just because the way that really good storytelling when you do these kind of plots that pay attention to the smallest details about how just changing one thing can change the whole trajectory of history. And Serling does really well with these time travel stories.
Agreed. And it's something that could really fall apart. The problem with time travel stories is if you pull one thread, the entire thing will fall apart. And so you have to have it be well written, and you have to get from point A to point B without making too many convoluted choices, because the more plot holes you throw at the audience, the more you're going to lose your audience. So the fact that this is a simple story, that is, as you pointed out, is really a talkie story, helps, because we're not given too many opportunities to lose the narrative. So I think that's a well written too. So that's partly because of the short story, but also partly because of Matheson's ability to write a tight script. So I like that too.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that
And
didn't? Oh, go ahead, please.
oh no, and I was just going to say the fact that it could be it's not talky just for talky's sake. They're setting up all this exposition, but it's done in a way that moves the plot along. It's not done in a I guess the word for it would be soapy kind of thing where you're just giving exposition just to give exposition, but you're really moving the story along because as Major Wilson and everybody else is getting information, the audience is too. So it's not wasted. It's not wasted dialogue at all.
Yeah, and that's a very good point because even with the Twilight Zone, it doesn't happen too often, but we do dip into the melodramatic, and we could easily do that here too. But I think to the actors' credit, they play this seriously enough to where we don't slip into that, and I think that's as well too. And also, I'm a sucker for a good. At this point, it's a '60s story, but for World War I, World War II stories, I think, especially World War I, because we don't hear much about it. I mean, obviously, with World War II being a little bit more contemporary for not our generation, but people we live with or have lived with, we know more about World War II, and I think it's still in the culture more than World War I. But there is a lot that happened, and you know this classics guy, but there's a lot that happened in World War I that we should remember and know about. And it's interesting that this is going to come out several weeks from now, but we are recording this the night before Memorial Day, so that's another reason why I think this episode is a strong one as well too. That sacrifices are always made, and it's usually from guys you'll never really hear about unless you talk to the guys who know the sacrifice was made.
Yeah, and we've also got a great military episode coming up next week with Purple Testament.
Yep.
And Rod Serling being a veteran himself and having fought in World War II, you can tell in all his military-themed episodes how much his time in the service really affected him as a person, because a lot of times they come across as his strongest episodes sometimes.
So what are some things that didn't work for you?
There's not really much you can say against it. We were talking about melodrama, and I did praise Kenneth High, who played Decker. There's a couple of times where he can walk the line into melodrama just a little bit. Not often, but it creeps in every once in a while. And I'm one of those people, I think, because I grew up on classic cinema and classic television, dialogue heavy stuff doesn't bother me, but maybe for a contemporary audience, sometimes the more dialogue heavy without much action going on would seem a little out of place for a contemporary viewer. But like you said, I think this episode holds up well, and it's not dialogue for dialogue's sake, it's moving the plot along.
I agree. And really, the only thing that I don't think works for me in this episode actually has nothing to do with this episode. It is completely my bias as a viewer looking at this, decades and decades later, is, as I mentioned, this kind of theme, this kind of story will be used several times in the Twilight Zone, and it is used quite often in sci-fi. So I have seen this story so much, and sometimes specifically this story. I mean, there's an episode of Torchwood, which is a BBC show, a spinoff of Doctor Who, that basically just takes this episode. A few folks come out of a cloud and land in a plane that is from the 1950s and have to go back. I mean, it is almost the exact same thing. So for me, it really, this is one of the first times that this is done. So it shouldn't be a bothersome to me, but just because I've seen this story a lot, it does kind of make it a little harder to enjoy the episode as much as I probably could have if I was watching this in the wee early months of 1960.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I always say I think it was Double Indemnity when I was talking with Craig and Anna about there's a scene where Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck have just murdered her husband, and they're trying to get away, and they're trying to get this car going, and the car stalls for the first couple of times they're trying to do it. We talked about, that's a trope we've seen so many times in so many suspense movies, but that was a fresh plot point in 1944. So you have to kind of put it, you have to put it in perspective when you watch stuff. So you always have to kind of put yourself in a 1944 or 1960 mindset when you watch it.
Agreed. So do you have anything else you want to wrap up with before we start giving this thing our score?
I don't think, just a really fresh episode, especially coming from what we just witnessed last week, where you had very cardboard cutout characterizations and a very sort of preachy, silly plot to something that has a lot of resonance, and you can tell has a lot of resonance with the people who were coming up with it.
Brandon! It is very interesting that, and Rod has said this in interviews he did back then. He pointed out, there are a third of the episodes are really good, a third of the episodes are and a third of the episodes are we just had to fill some time. And so it's interesting. We go from The Hitchhiker, which is one of the highest rated episodes of all time, down to The Fever, which is one of the lowest rated episodes of all time. And then we're back up here to an episode that is not one of the highest rated, but it definitely is an above average episode for the Twilight Zone. And I think we've kind of had an ebb and flow, and for the next few episodes, we're going to have a continued rise here again to a point where my flat out favorite episode of all time is coming up here in a few weeks. So we're definitely even only in episode 18 of 156, this, for the most part, this show is firing on all cylinders, and that says a lot to the cast. Not the cast. The cast changes every time. To the crew, to the writers, to Rod Serling himself. All of this just it's well made, and that says a lot for a show that's still in its infancy when we're talking about it here. So let's go ahead and give this our ranking. As you probably already heard through one of our other episodes, we rank these from 1 to 10, and they are based off their peers in the Twilight Zone. So a 5 ranking is an average episode of Twilight Zone. A 10 ranking is one of the best episodes of all time. A 1 is, because we just talked about it, The Fever. So, Brandon, where would you put Last Flight on a scale of 1 to 10?
I like I said, it's hard to say anything negative against the episode. The only thing I can say is I've seen groups of episodes before this that I just think stick out more and are just a little bit stronger. So I think this is a solid 8 episode for me. And
I grade typically on a lower curve than you, but I completely agree with everything you just said. I think there are some episodes we've already run into that were better than this, but this is by far an above average episode. So because, again, I tend to grade a little lower than you, my kids when I taught high school hated me for it. I'm going to give this episode a 7. But I still think it is a strong episode. So that will end our talk on this one. You can always find us at thefrontrowmoviereviews.com, where you can also find Brandon's classic podcast episodes, my flashback episodes, all our full disclosures, review episodes of new movies that have come out, and along with a whole bunch of other stuff that we talk about. We have quite a few shows out there, so there's something for everyone to like and enjoy. So check us out there. If you are listening to us as a podcast, please make sure to subscribe to us. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, be sure to subscribe to our new feed, which is Zone-i-Sodes itself. If you are listening to us on the front row feed, you're only going to be able to listen to us for a little bit longer, and then we're going to be leaving that feed. So please make sure that you check us out with our new Zone-i-Sodes feed. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please make sure to subscribe to the Front Row Movie Reviews and give us a thumbs up, and you'll be able to continue to find us at the Front Row's YouTube channel for as long as we care to be there.
Yeah.
So until we talk about the color purple, not really, but I guess. I am Scott McFarlane, and with me, as always, is, as he put it, a companion.
Well, would you like me to read Rod's final
Oh,
words?
I always do this. One of these days,
okay.
I will not screw that up. Go ahead.
That's okay. Dialogue from a play, Hamlet to Horatio. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Dialogue from a play written long before men took to the sky. There are more things in heaven and earth and in the sky than perhaps can be dreamt of. And somewhere in between heaven, the sky, the earth, lies the Twilight Zone.
And who the heck are you?
I'm Brandon Davis.
And until next time, folks, we will see you on the couch. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Zone-i-Sodes. Zone-i-Sodes is a special presentation of the Front Row Movie Reviews podcast. For more information, go to www.thefrontrowmoviereviews.com.